I'm a blackjack dealer at one of the swankier casino hotels out here in Las Vegas. I moved out here from rural Massachusetts in 2017, and as much as I love that Vegas lifestyle, people out here are crazy. And at some point during your life in the city of sin, you're gonna see some stuff you're never going to forget. And the thing that stands out by far in my mind is what I saw last Thanksgiving in the suburb of Henderson that I call home. Now, it's my day off, so I'm taking it easy and running some errands, but since I work nights, most of these errands take place around midnight. Vegas really caters to its shift workers, so you can get most things done even in the middle of the night. So I'm about halfway done with my chores when I stop off at a convenience store near my house to grab a coffee and some smokes. I'm at the coffee machine, plugging my order into the touchscreen when I hear some commotion from behind me. I turn around to see the most legitimately frightening thing I'd ever seen in my life. There's a guy standing at the counter of the convenience store, pointing a gun at the clerk. Only the guy with the gun had an actual skull tattooed on his face. He had a cross in the middle of his forehead, but the rest of his face was inked like a skull with shading below his eyes and on his cheeks, and teeth tattooed over his lips. What is it about that kind of facial tattooing that just screams, "I'm done with society"? Like an armed robbery is scary enough without the guy being obviously insane. He sees me staring at him, turns and points the gun at me. Then the next thing I know, I'm just scrambling behind a display shelf for cover, and I'm lucky he didn't pursue. I'm just crouched down, listening to this guy demanding that the clerk empty their register or he's going to open fire. And the whole time I'm just working out where the nearest exit is. I can either make a rush for the back fire escape or sneak around to the front, but if I'm caught, I'm probably going to get shot. So I start creeping towards the edge of the aisle, back to where the coffee machine has stood, hoping I can make a break for the fire escape if the shooting starts. It's weird the little details you remember about a moment like that. Side note, in my rush to get my coffee, I ended up using a medium cup after plugging in an order for a large iced latte. And as I'm kneeling there, fearing for my life, all I can hear is this drip, drip, drip of coffee next to me from my overflowing cup. Those sounds are just burned into my mind, the skull-faced guy barking orders, the noise of my heartbeat in my ears, and this drip, drip, drip of coffee. I reach the end of the aisle and start peeking out to see if the robber had his back turned, which he does not. If I tried to make a run for it right then, I wouldn't be typing this right now. But just before I pull back into cover, I can see someone else peeking out from an aisle near the store's entrance. It's this big Samoan guy with tattoos, just slowly edging out just like I was. At first I think they're going to make a run for it, so I figured I could use the distraction they made to bolt out the fire escape. But when they rear up and start to make a move, instead of just heading out the front entrance, they actually rush towards the skull-faced guy. I can't even imagine having that kind of bravery. That guy had every opportunity to escape that night, but instead, he chose to try to save everyone unlucky enough to be in the store when Skullface walked in with his loaded gun. Skullface had absolutely no idea what's coming, and the Samoan dude grabs his gun and starts wrestling with this dude. In an instant, other people in the store are rushing Skullface, trying to tackle him and get him pinned. Right then, the gun goes off. The Samoan guy just collapses onto the floor, and the other few guys who rush Skullface just soil their pants before trying to flee. By the time Skullface had turned around and was firing randomly through the shelves at the people that had attacked him, I was just face down on the floor, trying to get as low as I possibly could. When the shooting stopped, I heard someone rushing out of the store and screech off an engine. Then all was quiet. The silence only lasted a couple of seconds at the most, though, because then all I could hear was this horrible groaning from the people that had been hit by the random gunshots. Someone then called the all clear, saying the shooter was gone, and slowly we all began to emerge from where we were hiding. People were like, "My leg, my arm, I've been shot, help me, call 911. Then I heard screaming from outside where a passerby had suddenly seen the Samoan guy just bleeding out on the floor near the counter. Everyone who could was pulling out their cell phones and calling 911, and before long, the street outside was just this blinding mess of blue flashing lights. People were being hauled into ambulances, getting questioned by cops. All the while, I'm just in this bubble of adrenaline, unable to quite process all the stuff I'd just seen. I remember making a really big deal out of the Samoan guy, though, telling the cops how brave he was, how he'd been shot trying to wrestle the gun out of the skull-faced guy's hands. And I later found out that he was actually a Pacific Islander named Kevin Mendiola. Guy's a hero in my book, and I hope his mom and dad know what an incredible person they raised. I didn't ever think I'd see anything like that in my life, like an actual act of heroism. Or maybe I just hoped I wouldn't because it always involves something so violent or sad. But I saw one that night, an act of selfless courage from a person who probably saved all of our lives that night. Because the skull-faced man was actually in the middle of a rampage that ended up crossing state lines, and that night I'm pretty sure he killed a bunch of other people. Afterwards, I read that he and his methed-up girlfriend had been randomly shooting at cars on the highway, and I'm pretty sure they're being charged with some insane offenses or something now since the cops found a whole bunch of other weapons in their car when they caught them. Go ahead and Google Christopher McDonald and Vegas and you'll see the scumbag for yourself. He looks kind of pathetic in his mugshots, just some dumb criminal who made some really terrible body art decisions. But let me tell you, that night in the convenience store, he was a monster, an actual storybook monster come to life, and I sincerely hope I never have to run into anyone like that ever again. But if I do, I just hope that there's someone else like Kevin Mendiola around. Someone brave enough not to just shut down when death is staring them in the face. My big passion in life is bowling. I know that's a super nerdy passion to have in life, but I don't care. It makes me happy. I've been super into The Simpsons since I was a kid. Homer made bowling sound really cool. It is what it is. I actually bowl competitively too, mostly in local tournaments here in Sacramento, but most of the regional finals are held in Las Vegas of all places. So despite the fact that I'm not much of a drinker or a gambler, I find myself driving out to Vegas more often than I'd ever expected. So, on our way to 94 regionals, me and a friend of mine are about 100 miles south of Vegas on Interstate 15 near Halloran Springs Road. We picked up a rental car from Enterprise for the drive out there, and just an hour or so short of the finish line, the transmission went out on it. Luckily, I was able to coast down the off-ramp a little before I was able to pull over near this old truck stop. The place was a mess. Just a few dirty gas pumps and a dusty old sign that said gas and food. I'm surprised the payphone there even worked at all. I call up the Enterprise customer service line to see if they could get anyone out to fix the car, but the news wasn't good. Apparently we were smack bang in the middle of nowhere, and there wasn't a roadside assistance company they worked with within like 100 miles of us. It might take hours and hours for them to get a mechanic out to us, but they did have a pretty sweet proposition for us. Find someone to fix or tow us, and they'd reimburse us if we kept the receipts. That seemed fair enough to us, so we asked inside the truck stop if there are any mechanics he can call for us. He launches into this whole thing about how there's a mechanic, but he won't drive out, so he'd call his buddy who owned a tow truck to come get us so he could take us to the mechanic. It all sounded sketchy, but what can I say? I was desperate. If I missed out on a good night's sleep, I'd be screwed at the tournament, so anything that actually got us into Vegas on time seemed worth a try. Shortly after, a truck rolls into the truck stop that looked like something out of a Mad Max movie. A rust bucket that looked like it might fall apart at any time. The guy who stepped out of it looked like he hadn't showered in a week. He waddles up to us, easily 240 pounds of grease and dust, and tells us he actually knows of an Enterprise mechanic up near McCarran, and he'd take us there for $400. Can you believe that? 400. He could smell our desperation, and he hit us with a $400 fee. But what choice did I have? If I wanted to be in any sort of shape to bowl properly, I'd need a decent 8 hours, so I accepted the guy's offer and tell him I'll get him his cash when we reach the Enterprise place. In retrospect, I most definitely made the wrong decision. I was just so excited about the tournament. Like I really believed I had a fighting chance that year, and in my blind desperation, I'd have done anything to get us there on time. But getting in that guy's truck was probably the worst thing we could have done. And at the time, I couldn't climb into it fast enough. We were on the road for just over an hour. Although if you've told me we were actually on the road for 3 hours, I'd have actually believed you. Almost every single second was agony, and it was all down to the tow truck's driver's conversation topic of choice. According to him, he'd been driving a tow truck for like 200 years or whatever, and that means he'd been to his fair share of traffic accidents. Then the entire way to McCarran, he proceeds to tell us about every single crash he'd had to work, in detail. Each time we reach a part of the road there had been a wreck that he'd attended, he gives us a horrifically graphic description of each one. I just thought all the severed heads, charred bodies, and amputated limbs was kind of gross, and none of what he said really got to me. That was until we hit one section of road that reminded him of a particularly nasty wreck. In this one, a drunk driver doing a $110 down the highway veers over a few lanes and smashes into a lone woman driving the opposite way. The tow truck driver says he slammed into the side of her like a runway steam train. Just absolutely obliterated this poor woman's car. Only the thing is, the woman was pregnant too, and as the driver put it, the impact just burst her open. It's at that point that I have to politely stop the guy, telling him I thought he was oversharing, as they say. Now, I was pretty young at the time, much younger than I am now, and because this guy was old enough to be my dad, he felt entitled to talk to me like he was too. So, he starts lecturing me on the consequences of ignoring road safety, how I couldn't shy away from the realities of the modern world, all this other nonsense too. I agree. I actually did agree, but surely he could spare us the details. There's an awkward silence in the truck for a few miles, then, to my absolute shock, the truck driver starts telling us about the traffic accidents again. I couldn't believe my ears. I had specifically told this guy not to talk about those freaking accidents anymore, and there he was, once again telling us all this stuff that was enough to turn your stomach. And when he started giving us some graphic account about how a bus full of kids on a field trip managed to smash into a jackknife truck before bursting into flames, and how there were little burning critters just running all over the highway, I straight up lost my temper. I told him as such in no uncertain terms, and myself and my friend most definitely did not want to hear about burning children, and could he kindly shut up? What followed was another awkward silence, and instead of just continuing the drive, the fat guy pulls us over to the side of the road and turns off his engine. He then launches into a tirade about how we're lucky he's helping us, how we'd be screwed if it wasn't for him, and we were lucky he was only charging us $400. At that point, I was foolish enough to mention something about walking the rest of the way, and the driver just burst out laughing. He tapped at a grimy old temperature gauge on his dash, and I immediately got the message. But he still yammered on some tirade about how we'd die of heat stroke by mile 30 if we attempted the rest of the journey on foot. Knowing he was right hit me like a ton of bricks, and all I could do was nod along and apologize, softly begging him not to kick us out of the truck. We were stuck with him. He knew it, and we knew it too. Knowing he held all the cards, knowing he had all the power, it made me sick to my stomach. And since he knew well that he was fully in control, he carried on his little highway death tour speech all the way to McCarran. Only that time, something was different about the way he talked. He was disturbingly passionate about the whole thing, to the point where I actually thought he was getting off when telling us all this nightmarish stuff about broken, dead bodies either lying in car wrecks or lifeless at the side of the road. The more we seemed to wince, the more uncomfortable we were, the more engaged and animated he seemed to get. It was honestly one of the most unnerving and disturbing hours of my life, and it would have been better if we'd abandoned our Vegas trip altogether. Like we got to a mechanic who fixed the car and we managed to get to our hotel in time to get some decent sleep. Only sleep wouldn't come when I laid my head into the pillow. All I could think about was all those dead people, burning kids, all the pain and loss and suffering that the stretch of highway had seen over the years. And needless to say, I didn't get much sleep at all. That meant my performance at the bowling tournament was well and truly dire, and my team was eliminated in just the second round. We ended up driving home from Vegas exhausted, defeated, but most importantly, seriously disturbed. And you can bet I prayed for the transmission to hold until we got back to California because there was no way I was going to sit in a truck with that creepy old driver again. We were lucky he kept his greasy hands off of us, and next time, we might not be so lucky. I don't even know how to start this. Part of me wants to say something like, this story sounds unbelievable, but it's true. But I honestly don't know if it's believable or not, since I've never told it to anybody. Even the version of events I give my wife is complete nonsense, but it keeps her from asking too many questions. And I think if she knew the truth, she honestly might leave me, and that's why I want to maintain anonymity. Most people don't even know I've been to Vegas. I'm definitely not the partying type, never have been, and these days, I never even think about gambling or card games or anything like that, let alone talk about them. So, there's no way that anyone would guess that the single most significant moment in my life so far occurred on the outskirts of the gambling capital of the world. But it did. It all starts with a bachelor party. It was for my brother-in-law, a nice enough guy who didn't want to get up to anything too extreme, which suited me well enough. But like I said, I'm just not the partying type, nor am I one of those social butterflies that I keep hearing about. So after a while, I got pretty tired of drinking, then completely tapped out when one of the guys suggested going to a strip club. After I leave them, I'm walking back to my hotel room, and to get there I have to walk across the entire casino floor. This is a clever little trick the casinos pull to try to tempt you to gamble. And I bet I'm not the only sucker who fell for it, but as I'm walking through, I get the urge to play poker for some reason. I never played it before. I only had this vague idea that it looked cool from watching it on TV, so I decided to try it out. I can't even really explain what happened over the next few hours. First, I'm shyly explaining that I barely knew the rules of Texas Hold'em, and the next thing I know, I'm picking them up, and within the hour, I'd actually won a couple of games due to combinations of beginner's luck and raw intuition. I was hooked. By 11 o'clock that night, I was up $6,000 in poker winnings. The casino kept offering me free food and cocktails to keep me at the tables, and I naively obliged them. I didn't get drunk, but I'm almost certain I cleared them out of butterfly shrimp and Diet Cokes. But I was drunk on my newfound penchant for poker, and that inebriation caused me to make a very stupid decision. I won't bore you with the details, but not only did I end up losing the $6,000 I'd made, I ended up owing the casino a lot more. I can't even bring myself to type out the actual amount, so let's just skip all that in favor of the implications. Basically, with no mortgage payments, me and my wife were looking at losing the house. I had screwed up real bad, and I just remember feeling numb as I packed up my belongings and abandoned the bachelor party completely. It was quite a long drive back to the place I lived at the time, one that I started pretty early in the morning too, just as the sun was rising. I drive out of town, the roads are mostly empty, and I've just passed that little place, Sloan, when I see something in the distance at the side of the road. As I get closer, I realize it's a man in a suit, one that looked like he was drunkenly stumbling along the side of the highway, trying to thumb a lift. There was absolutely no way I was about to stop for a hitchhiker, but right as I'm about to pass him, this quick flash of red on white catches my eye and I realize the guy is actually hurt. I slam on the brakes, back up a little on the edge of the highway, and then jump out of the car with my cell phone to call 911. This guy collapses pretty much as soon as I get to him. I'm not sure how he managed to get hurt so bad, but the wound was real deep, so he'd either been stabbed with a big old knife or just straight up shot. I start asking him what his name is, just dumb stuff like that to keep him from passing out while I call 911. But he just starts gasping, things in a language that I didn't understand. It wasn't Spanish either. Like, it sounded European, but I just couldn't put my finger on it. Being around someone who was dying like that was truly traumatic. I actually saw the fear of death in that guy's eyes. It didn't matter at all what he was saying because that look needed no translation. He was begging me to save his life, but there wasn't a thing I could do other than call 911. Now, at some point between me trying to put pressure on this guy's stomach wound, trying to listen out for his name, and trying to talk to the 911 dispatcher, I see the guy was carrying a canvas bag. A canvas bag that was just lying there next to him. As I'm talking to the dispatcher, I lean over and open the thing up, thinking maybe there was some first aid supplies in there, maybe even just some water to make this guy more comfortable. When I see what's in there, I just go completely silent. Inside the bag is roll after roll of $100 bills. More cash than I'd ever seen in my life. Last thing I remember was hearing the dispatcher saying, "Sir? Are you still there, sir?" before I hung up the phone. What followed was the most shameful act of my life. I just got up, grabbed the bag of money, and started walking back to my car. The guy reaches out with a bloody hand and grabs my right sneaker. The first thought in my head wasn't, I should stop what I'm doing and actually help this guy. It was more like, well, I'll have to burn the shoe when I get back. I ignored what I assumed were pleas for help in whatever language it was, pulled my sneaker free from his grip, and continued on towards my car. Just typing that out, I have no idea I could ever be so cold. No clue whatsoever regarding what a monster I could actually be. All it took was a serious financial problem, and I was ready to rob a dying man just before driving off, and driving away almost certainly condemned him to death. I drove non-stop too. Didn't stop for a single second until I was home, where I could dispose of the bloody sneaker and stash the money somewhere my wife would never find it. I took a shower, told her I'd left early because I wasn't feeling well, sent the same lie via text to my brother-in-law, and tried to just get on with my life. But it turned out not to be so easy as just pretending the whole thing didn't happen. It was on my mind for the next 18 months almost constantly. At first it was the anxiety of thinking the cops would track me down, having found some of my DNA or shoe print at the scene. But no one from law enforcement ever called, and although I checked a whole bunch, I didn't see anything about the guy's death in the media, so that fear kind of subsided. I also worried about the bills being marked, but that turned out not to be the case either. But then came the fear that the money somehow belonged to some kind of cartel or gang, like I kept thinking about that No Country for Old Men movie, and it put the fear of God into me. I must have gone through those rolls of hundreds like 1,000 times, looking for tracking devices or bugs or whatever, but again, didn't find any, and no one ever visited the house. All the money is gone now, either funneled into investments or just used as petty cash. There's nothing physically connecting me to what happened out there in the desert anymore, and only now do I feel like I can actually talk about it, even if it is without giving away too many details about myself. I know people are just going to call me a thief or a coward, or say that the money didn't even exist in the first place. I know what I am. I'm a monster for stealing that guy's money and letting him die, but I am most definitely not a liar. I just want to end with a little reassurance, though. That money haunted me for as long as I had it. I had a full head of brown hair when I found that guy at the side of the road. Now, I'm receding badly and I have little flecks of gray around my temples. But I realized something. I wouldn't take it back. I'd steal that money all over again if it gave me the chance. The monster that allowed me to steal it in the first place is still just right there inside me, just waiting to wake up again. And that's what scares me the most. Every Labor Day weekend when I was a kid, my dad would drive me, my mom, and my little sister up to Vegas for the weekend. You'd be surprised how many kid-friendly things there were to do in Sin City. I mean, they had to have something to entertain the ankle-biters while Dad gambled away all his money at the craps tables. My dad wasn't some degenerate gambler, but he did enjoy a little blackjack between our visits to Red Rock Canyons. So, Mom would take us to the Disney store shopping for clothes while Dad blew off some steam. We used to have a whole bunch of Vegas traditions, too. One of them was stopping off at this little place called Prima Donna Resort and a place called Prim, right on the state line. We'd take a bathroom break, grab a bite to eat, and Dad would get some last-minute gambling done in the casino there. So it's 1997, I'm 12 years old, and we just finished eating in one of the restaurants at the Prima Donna. Dad is upstairs gambling, and my sister wasn't feeling well, so Mom's attention was taken up with her. I was bored out of my mind, and I knew the vacation was coming to an end, so I guess I was just feeling restless. I got up from the table and wandered off into the resort. Almost immediately, my attention is grabbed by the fact that the resort had its very own arcade. I don't know how many of you remember the golden age of video game arcades, but those places were like paradise for a kid like me. And as a grown-up, one of my real ambitions is to own a working time crisis machine. But at the time, I could see these two older kids screwing around among the machines, not even playing anything, just like playing hide and seek or something, so I remember being way too intimidated to go look at the games. This one kid had like a plain shirt on and baggy shorts, but for some reason he had loafers on instead of sneakers, and I remember that getting my attention and thinking that it was kind of weird. Anyway, instead of exploring the arcade like I wanted to, I ended up looking around for a bathroom to take a leak. I remember seeing a little girl walk into one bathroom and thinking, oh, okay, that's the girls, and looking for the other door, but then the loafers kid walks into the same bathroom just after the little girl. And I was like, what? I had to do a double take on the door signs to make sure I was going into the boys' room, but I quickly realized that loafers kid did actually go into the girls' bathroom instead of the boys'. After I pee, I head back to my mom and try to tell her that someone's broken the cardinal rule of going into the wrong bathroom, but she's way too occupied with my feverish little sister to really listen to me. I mean, I don't blame her. I used to tell all sorts of tall tales when I was younger, and I guess she just didn't take me seriously. A few minutes later, I see Loafer's kid in the parking lot, lifting his shirt up while talking to some girls. I don't know if it was him showing off or whatever, I never figured that out, because the next thing, there's all this screaming in the lobby. I wasn't quite sure what was going on, nor did I have time to work out what happened, because a short while later my dad appears, having heard the screaming, and we ended up starting the drive back to San Diego a little earlier than expected. The next couple of days were incredibly weird. At one point I caught my mom crying while watching the news. I asked her what was wrong, but all she did was switch the TV off really quickly and hug me. I was so confused and worried that I ended up crying too while we swapped I love yous. I knew something bad had happened back at the Prima Donna, and I knew it was affecting my parents. I just didn't quite know what that thing was, and I didn't find out till years later either. But when I did, I'm glad my parents kept me in the dark about it, because it's one of the most messed up things I'd ever read about. And knowing it all happened just a few feet away from me is something I struggled to deal with. You see, the loafer's kid's name was Jeremy Strohmeyer. He was the 18-year-old adopted son of this rich family from Long Beach who had also spent Labor Day in Vegas. I'm talking baller money too. Like, this kid's adopted parents were so rich that they bought him flying lessons and an actual plane. Jeremy hadn't gone into the girls' bathroom on a whim that afternoon either. He did so because he was following a 7-year-old girl named Charisse Iverson. I read that he managed to talk her into trapping herself in the bathroom by telling her it was the only place she'd be safe from him after he'd chased her around the arcade for a while. Then when she walked in, he followed her. And then when he was inside, Loafer's kid drags the girl into a stall and puts his hand over her mouth to keep her quiet. I don't even want to get into what happened after that. But when it was over, this 18-year-old man, because that's what he was legally, takes this 7-year-old girl and snaps her neck. Not just that, but he makes this half-hearted attempt to conceal her body by folding her in half and stuffing her in the toilet. From what I understand, at that point I saw him lifting up his shirt to the girls in the parking lot. He'd literally just murdered a child, yet there he was, flirting with girls just moments later. And that's what I find the most horrifying about it. This guy was able to act like nothing had happened. It was pretty much an open and shut case, too. Jeremy admitted to killing the little girl because she could identify him as having touched her, and as the whole story unfolded, the public discovered his history of serious mental illness. In his police interviews, he even used slurs to describe the little girl he'd murdered, and that part blew my mind. Like, how can you take a child's life and then just casually call her stuff like that? How effing crazy have you got to be? I particularly remember reading about how Jeremy didn't have any trouble getting girls, and how he was actually quite popular. Only some of the girls he'd dated were contacted by the media, who managed to get these creepy quotes about how he used to make them dress up like little girls. I know he was facing the death penalty for a while, until he took a plea deal or something. Turns out Jeremy wasn't afraid to kill, but he was afraid to die. And at his trial, I read how the judge told him that what he'd done was one of the worst crimes the judge had ever presided over, and how they'd make sure he would rot in prison. I think there was one weird silver lining to the whole thing. Something about how couples adopting kids had a right to see the medical history of their parents. The state talked about how that would make things better for adoptive parents, but I don't really see how you can predict which kids are going to turn out to be killers. I mean, Jeremy certainly didn't look like one, not in his baggy shorts and his loafers. He just looked like a beach bum, not someone who was capable of killing a kid. It's the fact that I maybe could have stopped it too. If I'd have kicked up enough of a fuss or followed Jeremy into the bathroom to say something. But who knows? Maybe if I'd gone into the girls' bathroom that afternoon, Jeremy would have killed me too. For a couple of years afterwards, I wondered why our bathroom breaks at the Prima Donna stopped being one of our Vegas traditions. Mom and Dad would just tell me we didn't have time to stop there anymore. But now I know why they wanted to avoid the place like a plague. Like, I don't believe in ghosts or anything, but I think I believe that a place can be haunted by the things that happen there. And I know that the Prima Donna was haunted by what happened on Labor Day weekend of 1997. They even had to change their name because of all the media attention. They have to be haunted. Because I know I certainly am. It's 3 o'clock in the morning at an isolated Las Vegas intersection on the 22nd of February 2017. On any other night, the only people that might be around would be a handful of homeless folks trying to make themselves as comfortable as possible on their beds of concrete and gravel. But on this night, they have company. The intersection is often visited by representatives of homeless outreach programs, but the person joining them tonight isn't interested in helping them. He is there for one reason alone: to kill. The homeless residents of Las Vegas are particularly vulnerable, since Nevada is one of 4 western states, along with California, Hawaii, and Oregon, in which over half the homeless population do not reside in shelters or temporary housing. Instead, they live on the streets or in vehicles, parks, tunnels, and other places unfit for human habitation. 2 homeless men have already been murdered at this same location, surrounded by freeways and far from the neon lights of the Vegas Strip. Both were bludgeoned to death with a blunt object, and the perpetrator has once again returned to hunt. A hooded figure is pacing back and forth in front of a pile of blankets that have the distinct shape of a sleeping person beneath them. and in the hooded figure's hand is a claw hammer, 4 pounds of molded steel designed to bash and tear through timber and brick. The figure raises the hammer above his head and affixes his gaze to where he believes his sleeping victim's head is. Then, with both hands gripping the hammer's rubber handle, he brings the blunt side of the steel head down, hard. But the sounds that echo through the chilly Nevada night is not the one he has become accustomed to hearing. It is not the crack of a broken skull, but rather something else. What's more, there is no darkening of the blanket around the victim's head from blood being soaked up by fabric. 30-year-old Shane Schindler has gone out that night to take the life of a homeless person, but instead, he ended up using his hammer on nothing more than a plastic mannequin. As his confusion begins to register, Schindler is blinded by the beams of flashlights that seemingly come out of nowhere. Hidden police officers reveal themselves, pointing their weapons at him and demanding he drop the hammer. Schindler does as he's told, tossing the prospective murder weapon aside before lying face down in the dirt. As officers restrain him and the handcuffs click around his wrists, Schindler realizes that he has fallen for a rather ingenious sting operation. The operation was masterminded by a Las Vegas police captain, Andrew Walsh. As they say every time a homeless person is murdered, the sidewalk or a soft patch of dirt is no place for a human being to take their last breath. We took those crimes very personally. They're the lost faces of our community, he told a gathering of journalists after Schindler had been arrested. At a press conference, Walsh explained that he had instructed his officers to place a series of human decoys on the ground in the area the homeless killings had been taking place. The bizarre tactic came after having absolutely no luck in the investigation. They had no witnesses, no motive, nothing to point them in the direction of the murderer. Desperate times called for desperate measures. Once the decoys were placed, police officers used a mix of hidden cameras and plainclothes detectives to keep an eye on the bait, and it was one of these plainclothes detective units that watched as Shane Schindler attacked their plastic mannequin. He was immediately arrested and charged with carrying a concealed weapon without a permit, a charge which would buy detectives the time they needed to make a murder charge stick. But Schindler's defense attorney claimed that the concealed weapon charge was entirely trumped up. He asserted that carrying a hammer in a bag was not a crime. Otherwise, every construction worker and carpenter in the country would be arrested for the exact same thing. But luckily, the police managed to keep him in jail, with the judge having agreed that the damage done to the mannequin was enough to confirm that Schindler intended to kill someone that night. Then, all it took was linking Schindler and the hammer attack to the other 2 homeless bludgeonings that occurred in the weeks before. It was practically an open and shut case, and Schindler took the advice of his defense attorney, taking the attempted murder plea deal offered to him by state prosecutors. If he chose to fight the charges, he could well end up being sentenced to death. And so, a Nevada judge sentenced Schindler to 8 years for attempted murder, although it is worth noting that this is simply to buy time for Vegas police to put together an airtight murder charge against him, so that the homeless population of Las Vegas can hope to taste a measure of justice. Little is known about the 2 other men that Shane Schindler is believed to have murdered, but we do know that one of them was a 46-year-old man named Daniel Aldape. Daniel had only been living on the streets for around 4 months in January of 2017, and he still kept in touch with his family, whom he called every few weeks so he could catch up with them. But one day, the calls simply stopped. Daniel had become Shane Schindler's first victim. At the very same intersection at which he was arrested, a 40-year-old homeless woman named Stacy Carney told journalists that the murders had rocked her impoverished, tight-knit community. She mentioned how they were terrified, shocked to the core by something that sounded more like a horror movie than a reality for them. But all of the interviewed homeless were deeply thankful to the Vegas cops who organized the mannequin sting, with Stacy herself saying, "I think it's really cool how they set up that dummy to catch him." Though the Las Vegas homeless murders were extreme in their ghastliness, violent acts directed against homeless people are not entirely uncommon. According to the National Coalition for the Homeless, there were 27 murders in the Vegas homeless community in 2015 alone. The NCH also documented a total of over 1,500 acts of violence against homeless people between 1999 and 2015, mostly committed by men in their teens and early 20s. Some believe that those sorts of crimes are linked to disrespectful and demeaning portrayals of homeless people on TV and in movies. Viral videos such as bum fights, in which homeless men are paid to brawl, are often cited as main examples. It seems homeless people are not just attacked because of bias or bigotry, but simply because they're vulnerable, because those who kill them believe they won't be missed. And perhaps that's the most terrifying thing about these homeless killings. They're viewed as less than human, fit for nothing more but extermination by those that opt to target them. And given how vulnerable some of us are to homelessness, especially in light of the recent pandemic, it's horrifying to consider just how many people with a roof over their head are just a few misfortunate incidents away from also being stripped of their humanity. Although that separates us from poor souls like Daniel Adape, all that keeps us from being the one lying on the sidewalk with our brains leaking out of our skulls is a little bad luck. Al Bramlett was born on his family's small farm near Jonesboro, Arkansas on February 18, 1917. After serving in the United States Navy during World War II, Bramlett moved to Los Angeles and became a bartender, later serving as a business agent for a bartenders' local union. But shortly afterward, Bramlett heard that there was ample opportunity for a man with his skills in the gambler's haven of Las Vegas. So in 1946, he picked up sticks and moved east to Vegas, where he quickly joined the Culinary Workers Union. And much like in Los Angeles with the Bartenders Union, Bramlett showed intelligence and diligence when conducting union affairs, and in 1954, he became its secretary-treasurer. Under Bramlett's centralized leadership, the membership of the Culinary Workers Union swelled from just 1,500 to over 22,000. This is largely a credit to Bramlett's passion for worker organization, a passion which sometimes led him to implement some rather aggressive measures. For example, in his late 50s, he attempted to convince the owner of the Alpine Village restaurant to allow his workers to join his union. But when the owner refused, Bramlett had paid-up union members picket the restaurant. Al told the owners that the picket would last as long as he forbade his employees' unionization, and so it did for almost 20 years, until the owners finally capitulated. He was also known for organizing and coordinating some extremely effective worker strikes. Whenever his union members' bosses were getting a little too exploitative, Bramlett would call a strike, and between the years of 1967 and 1976, Bramlett organized 3 major strike actions that were so effective that they caused 12 of the 15 major hotel casinos to close their doors. But as you can imagine, being the head of such an influential Vegas union forced Bramlett into some pretty unsavory encounters with some pretty unsavory people. At one point, the parent union of the local 226 sent a man named Tony Spilatro over from Chicago to talk to Bramlett regarding the introduction of a dental plan. Bramlett sat the man down, listened to what he had to say, and immediately recognized the scheme as being masterminded by the mob. Bramlett flat out refused the man's offer, then told him where to go. As a result, the parent company tried to wrestle control of the union's health and welfare funds away from Bramlett, who had to file legal action to stop what was undoubtedly a shrewd attempt at infiltration from the mafia. Bramlett then got another visit from Tony Spilatro, but this time, Tony wasn't in the mood to talk. Instead, he beat Al Bramlett so hard that he had to be taken to the hospital afterwards. So, when we learn that Bramlett was later kidnapped from McCarran International Airport, it's not out of the question to assume some degree of mafia involvement. But the truth is far more shocking and terrifying. Remember, Bramlett had his union members picket the Alpine Village restaurant for almost 20 years? It wasn't the constant protests that made the owners change their mind about unionizing. It was the fact that in December of 1975, 2 bombs exploded on the roof of the restaurant, causing extensive damage but no casualties. Then, just a month later, a second bomb exploded at another non-union restaurant named David's Place. Unsurprisingly, the owners allowed their employees to unionize not long after, and for a while, almost every other food service outlet in Vegas followed suit. That was until 1977 when 2 restaurants opened up that refused to follow the trend. They were more than aware of the risks involved in running a non-union establishment in a place like Las Vegas, and maybe that's what helped them spot the 2 abandoned cars in their parking lots, the ones that had been left alone for a suspiciously long time, the ones that turned out to have unexploded bombs in their trunks. A month after, 2 hikers were making their way through the desert near Potosi Mountain when they saw something lying near their trail. It was the body of Al Bramlett, and he had been shot 6 times with a .22 caliber handgun, with 2 of the entry wounds being around each of his ears. Police quickly suspected a mafia execution and took the ear shooting to mean that the mob had Al killed because he wouldn't listen. Yet when the cops managed to pick up the father and son bomb-making team that were responsible for the 2 unexploded devices, they were astonished to hear that not only were they not mafia-affiliated, but it was them that had killed Al Bramlett. But even more shocking was that Al was apparently killed because he had ordered the bombings of the non-union restaurants. The father-son bomb makers, Granby and Tom Hanley, told police that Bramlett had instructed them to place bombs at certain locations, unaware that the destruction they wrought stemmed from nothing more than labor disputes. Bramlett had apparently paid them $10,000 for every bombing, but when their devices in the parking lots of the village pub and the starboard tack failed to explode, Bramlett refused to pay them for their work. After a period of argument and bargaining, the Hanleys simply decided that they would use violence and intimidation to get their payment and hatched the plan for the kidnapping. At first, Bramlett still refused to pay the pair, citing shoddy work, but when he realized his life was on the line, he ordered $10,000 to be sent to Binion's Horseshoe Casino. However, the money was never picked up. This could have been because of a miscommunication, but more likely because Granby Hanley had already murdered Bramlett in a rage. Once he realized what he'd done, the pair decided to try to escape with their freedom intact rather than pursue the money they were owed. Each received a life sentence for their involvement in the killing, and the father, Granby, ended up passing away in a federal prison. Al's story might seem like just another form of the golden age of mafia-controlled Las Vegas, but it has a very pertinent and rather terrifying moral. It seems when a person believes they're doing the right thing, when they believe they have justice and morality on their side, it often leads to some grotesque displays of fury and violence. In his pursuit of workers' rights and independence from organized crime, Al Bramlett saw fit to commence a wave of terrifying bombings to further his goals. But as they say, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And the terror he felt in his final moments out in the desert must have mirrored the terror he inflicted on those he bombed. The terror of a man who had started out trying to make the world a better place, only to end with a bullet in his head. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join a live stream to catch an invite to my Discord, and if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.